Hello, I'm Dr. Jennifer Degler, and this is the second video in our series on how to help your stressed out brain chill out. And we're talking this time about why you may be a born worrier. So if you're somebody that really your whole life you feel like you've been a bit of a worrywart and you tend to get anxious and react more strongly to situations that are uncertain than the average person does. Maybe you even feel kind of bad about that, kind of guilty about that, or like there's something wrong with you. I want to explain to you why you may have been born this way, and that is not your fault. So, one of the biggest reasons why you may be a born worrier is because of genetics, because this does tend to run in families. And so, remember, we were talking about your brain in the previous video, that this was your brain. And we talked about the limbic system and the prefrontal cortex here in your brain. So, you may have been born with just not enough neurotransmitters in your prefrontal cortex. That's particularly true if you've always been depressed, you've always been struggling with anxiety. It may also be that in that hypothalamus, remember we talked about the hypothalamus being part of that limbic system, it may have either too many stress receptors or stress receptors that are just too sensitive. Or you may have all three, not enough neurotransmitters, too many stress receptors, and stress receptors that are too sensitive. Or maybe two of them, or one of them, or all three of them. But what happens is when you are born with a nervous system like this, then little things feel like big things in your brain. So when other people are like, why are you reacting like this? Why are you overreacting? Why don't you calm down? They don't understand that if you would, you could, but inside your brain, this thing that feels little to them feels really big to your brain. And what happens then when that whole system gets activated, we talked about that in the previous video about how you flip your lid and the prefrontal cortex goes offline and you just go limbic at that point where it's just running on emotion. Then your fight versus flight response is activated and your body is flooded with those stress hormones, with cortisol, with adrenaline. And so your body's ready to fight or flight or freeze if you can't do either one of those. And so the brain is just pumping out those hormones like an emergency is happening. And so your body is full of adrenaline. Nobody else's body is full of adrenaline. But that's making you feel like this is a really big thing that's happening. I want you to understand what's happening to you is a neural hijacking, and it's not your fault. And listen, if you are a believer, a follower of Jesus Christ, a lot of times people that struggle with this feel like they don't have any faith or that they're not a very good Christian. And I want you to understand that that's not what this is about, any more than if you had diabetes, that you would be lacking in your faith because your pancreas couldn't produce enough insulin. If you've always been this way, likely your nervous system was born this way. Now, the good side of that is that you are probably a highly imaginative, deeply feeling, empathetic person. And it gave God great pleasure to create you that way. We need you in the world. We need people who are creative. You're never going to run out of ideas. We need people like you who can plan. We need people like you who can really feel things and connect with other people and are empathetic. The problem is you're a highly imaginative, deeply empathetic person. So when your mind begins to tell you scary stories, they're very vivid. They come in Technicolor, surround sound, and they seem really real. And because you can feel deeply, you really feel those emotions deeply. So anxiety treatment is not about changing you and making you into this person with no imagination who's dull and who's unfeeling. It's about learning to channel those gifts in a way that is helpful to you instead of a way that is hijacking your brain and making you tell yourself really scary stories. Another reason why you may be a born worrier is you may have had anxious parents. And so they modeled for you getting anxious and worried. And so if they overreacted a lot, then that's training you as well. And it actually does train your amygdala to be afraid of things that normally perhaps you wouldn't be afraid of. So if you had a parent who was very afraid of dogs, and as a little kid, most little children, when they're very small, they're not afraid of dogs. They're intrigued by dogs. But if every time a dog was even in the room, your parents snatched you up and held you close and seemed very afraid, then they were training you. Dogs are scary. Dogs are dangerous. And so that amygdala, that smoke detector in your brain, was learning and animals are dangerous. Also in an overprotective home where you have maybe helicopter parents who are hovering, or those steam shovel parents who just shovel all the trouble out of the way, and you never have to deal with your own situations and learn how to cope, learn how to be resilient, then you don't learn coping strategies. You learn that uncertainty is intolerable. And the problem solving part of your brain, that prefrontal cortex, which is your problem solving part of your brain, it actually is kind of underdeveloped because you've never had to use it, because your parents have always loaned you their problem solving brain. Another reason why you may be a born worrier is just life circumstances. If you had trauma in your history or early losses, like an early loss of a parent, maybe you were in a serious accident or some kind of natural disaster, it exposes that amygdala to scary situations at a very young age. And so what can happen then as you grow up is the brain is very hypervigilant to scary situations because it's trying to keep you safe. You can also end up developing triggers where that amygdala, remember we talked about that, how it's low in your brain, that it learns by association. So if it had something really scary happen, perhaps in a cellar, you all were hiding out in a cellar during a tornado, it may learn to associate any underground room that's dark or any storm as being very, very dangerous, even if they're not. And so what can happen is then later in life, when you're in a situation that's similar to that, maybe you're you just feel like, I can't go in people's basements because I just begin to feel panicky. Oftentimes it's because that amygdala has gotten a trigger. It's learned falsely that basements are always dangerous when really they're not. Chronic stress, when you are, even perhaps it's not like a huge trauma that you went through, but you just grew up in a home where there was a lot of open conflict. Maybe you had an addicted parent, maybe you had a rageaholic for a parent, or a very emotionally deprived home where everyone was very cold. That's stressful. It's a low level of chronic stress, and that keeps your brain pumping out stress hormones. And so the brain takes a bath in cortisol the whole time you're growing up. And that can affect the brain as well and make it where your nervous system is just more likely to be easily hijacked by worry and anxiety. And you never really get a chance to replenish those neurotransmitters that would help you feel calmer, some serotonin, because every bit of it's always being used up by this chronic stressful environment that you grew up in. Another thing that can cause you to be a born worrier is poor sleep and nutrition. When I'm working with someone who's dealing with anxiety, the first thing we work on is their sleep, because your nervous system only repairs itself while you're asleep. So if you're getting very little sleep, you literally are waking up, and as my mom used to say, she'd say, "Oh, I feel like I'm on my last nerve," or "My nerves are frayed, my nerves are ragged." And if we could kind of look at your nervous system, which runs throughout your entire body, we would see that it's not in very good shape because you weren't sleeping and it wasn't able to repair itself. So it's really important that you get good sleep. You also need certain nutrients to make neurotransmitters and to have good circulation in your body. And so getting that good nutrients up into your brain as well. So that's why if you don't eat well, then that can make you more anxious. And lastly, another thing that really contributes to you being a worrier is technology. You know what's keeping me in business right now? It's all this exposure to technology. Anxiety is on the rise in large part because we have too much access to too much information too often, and that causes us to get addicted to certainty. We get to the point where we feel like I cannot tolerate any uncertainty. We train our brains that it is dangerous for me to not have the answer right now. You know, when I was a kid and I would go on choir tour in the summer for a week with a bunch of other teenagers, it was so much fun. But I was only allowed to call home one time, and we could only talk on the phone about 10 minutes because long distance was really expensive. And so for that whole week, my parents had no idea how I was doing. And other parents had no idea how their kids were doing until they finally got their one phone call, and some kids never called home. And maybe the parents would, you know, if they had an opportunity, they'd connect with, hey, have you heard from the kids? Oh, yeah, they're doing fine. But they had to learn to live with that uncertainty of not knowing how their kids were doing. And overall, parents were a lot less anxious than they are now because you see, their amygdala had learned it's okay to not know how your child's doing at this exact moment. But you see, now if I want to know how my daughter's doing, she lives in Charlotte, North Carolina, while I live in Kentucky, all I have to do is send her a quick text and I can find out how she's doing. Or if I want to know how my son is doing at work, I can send him a quick text, how you doing? That is actually not good for my brain. It would be far better for me to just live with that uncertainty. So if I don't know the name of that song, if I can't remember it, it's really better if I don't sound hound that song, because I need to reteach my brain that it's okay for me to be uncertain. Otherwise, I just need more and more and more certainty and more information in order for my brain to calm down. The only problem is getting more and more information is actually activating and making you more nervous. So it's a really great idea to unplug from all the notifications, to unplug from checking the news over and over, getting the headlines, because that can really make you a lot more anxious. So in our next video, we're going to talk about what you can do to manage your anxiety.